The Harrison Clockworks factory had been dying for 2 decades, but Julian Vance was the man hired to finally put a bullet in it. At 34 years old, Julian was the youngest managing partner at Vanguard Acquisitions. His job was simple, brutal, and highly lucrative. He bought companies that time had forgotten, stripped them for parts, fired the staff, and sold the real estate to luxury developers. He did not care what the factory used to make. He did not care about the 4 generations of men and women who had worked there. He cared that the brick warehouse in the historic district was sitting on $4.2 million of prime commercial zoning. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. The factory was scheduled to be permanently padlocked at midnight. Julian was doing his final walkthrough alone, calculating the scrap value of the vintage brass machinery. His Italian leather shoes echoed sharply against the oil-stained floorboards, a rhythmic ticking that sounded like a countdown. He checked his watch. An $85,000 Patek Philippe. 12 minutes until midnight. 12 minutes until he locked the doors and added another 7-figure commission to his portfolio. There was only one other person in the building. At the far end of the assembly floor, an old man in a faded slate blue jumpsuit was sweeping. His name was Elias. He was 74 years old, and he was profoundly deaf. Elias swept with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, the stiff bristles of the broom catching the brass shavings and dust that had accumulated over a century of manufacturing. Julian watched him for a moment with mild irritation. He had signed Elias's termination papers 3 weeks ago. The severance was minimal, a standard package for a custodial worker. Julian didn't know the old man's name, didn't care to know it, and certainly didn't understand why the fool was still sweeping a floor that was going to be demolished by a wrecking ball in less than a month. Julian walked past him without a nod, heading for the heavy iron gates of the freight elevator. He needed to check the basement vaults one last time to ensure the copper wiring hadn't been stripped by local scavengers. He pulled the heavy iron accordion gate open. The elevator was an antique Otis model from 1922, a massive steel cage driven by exposed gears and thick braided cables. Julian stepped inside, pulling his phone from his pocket to draft an email to his contractors. Just as Julian reached for the heavy brass lever to descend, a mop bucket rattled over the threshold. Julian looked up, annoyed. Elias stepped into the elevator, carrying his bucket and a ring of heavy brass keys. The old man didn't look at Julian. He didn't offer a subservient smile or an apology. He simply stood in the corner, staring straight ahead, perfectly still, radiating a quiet dignity that Julian found immediately irritating. "Take the stairs, old man, I'm in a hurry," Julian snapped, waving his hand dismissively. Elias didn't move. He couldn't hear a word Julian said, but even if he could, the factory rules were clear. The freight elevator was for equipment. Elias had equipment. Julian rolled his eyes, muttered a curse about union liabilities, and threw the brass lever forward. The heavy steel cage shuddered. The gears above them groaned with the weight of decades. The elevator began its slow, grinding descent into the belly of the factory. Before we continue the story, if you believe that true intelligence isn't about how much money you make, but about what you know how to fix when everything breaks down, please like this video, subscribe to Still Waters Stories, and share this with someone who respects real, honest work. The descent was supposed to take 40 seconds. At second 22, somewhere between the ground floor and the subterranean vaults, the factory groaned. It wasn't a mechanical snap. It was a deep, structural sigh, followed by a violent jolt that threw Julian against the steel grate. The elevator stopped instantly. The single amber bulb in the ceiling flickered, buzzed like an angry hornet, and died. Total darkness. "Hey!" Julian shouted, scrambling to his feet, his hands grasping the cold iron grating. "Hey, turn the power back on!" Silence. Julian fumbled for his phone, his thumb swiping wildly to activate the flashlight. The harsh white beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dust motes suspended in the stale air. He pointed the light at his screen. No service. The basement of the Harrison Clockworks was encased in 3 feet of reinforced concrete and brick. No cellular signal had ever penetrated it. Unbelievable, Julian hissed, slamming his palm against the steel wall. He turned to Elias, pointing the flashlight directly into the old man's face. "Did you do this? Is this some kind of union stunt? Hit the emergency button." Elias simply squinted against the harsh light. He calmly reached up and gently pushed Julian's phone downward, so the beam was aimed at the floor, not in his eyes. Then, Elias set his mop aside, crossed his arms, and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The temperature in the shaft began to drop, the damp chill of the subterranean earth seeping through Julian's bespoke suit. But worse than the cold was the claustrophobia. Julian Vance was a man who required control. He dictated terms. He set schedules. Being trapped in an iron cage, suspended in the dark, completely disconnected from his network, was unraveling him. He pressed the alarm button. Nothing happened. The power to the entire grid had failed. He screamed until his throat was raw. He kicked the doors, scuffing his expensive Oxfords, bruising his heel. Through it all, Elias did not panic. The old man sat on his overturned mop bucket in the corner of the elevator, watching Julian with the calm, detached interest of a biologist watching a moth batter itself against a window pane. At the 45-minute mark, Julian was hyperventilating. His tie was discarded. His expensive suit jacket was thrown on the floor. He was pacing the tiny 6x6 space like a caged animal, muttering to himself, his chest heaving. "I have a flight at 6 a.m. I have a board meeting. I can't be in here. Someone has to know we're in here. We're going to run out of air." He slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor, his head in his hands. The great, powerful CEO reduced to a shivering, panicking child in the dark. It was then that Elias finally moved. The old man stood up. He didn't look at Julian. Instead, he walked to the bare steel wall of the elevator cab. He took off his heavy canvas work gloves, tucking them into his belt. Julian looked up, his flashlight beam trembling. "What are you doing? There's no panel there, it's solid steel." Elias couldn't hear him. The old man placed his bare palms flat against the cold iron wall. He closed his eyes. He pressed his forehead against the metal. For the last 20 years, Elias had lived in absolute silence. When he lost his hearing, the world didn't disappear, it just changed frequencies. He learned to listen with his skin, his bones. He knew the factory not by the sound of its machines, but by the rhythm of its vibrations. He could tell if a lathe on the 3rd floor was misaligned by a millimeter just by the hum in the floorboards. Right now, he was listening to the elevator. Julian watched in stunned silence as the old janitor moved his hands across the wall, inch by inch, feeling the subtle tension in the steel cables hanging above them. Elias paused. He tapped the wall with his knuckle. He moved 2 inches to the left. He tapped again. He felt a resonance, a blockage in the secondary braking mechanism. The power outage had triggered the emergency pneumatic clamps, but they had seized on the rusted rails. Elias turned and looked at Julian. He pointed to the flashlight, then pointed to the ceiling panel. Julian, stripped of all his arrogance, wordlessly handed the phone to the old man. Elias climbed onto his overturned mop bucket. He reached up to the grated ceiling. With a strength that defied his 74 years, he pushed the heavy emergency hatch open. He pulled a small, worn leather roll from his back pocket. Julian expected to see a janitor's tools, a wrench, maybe a screwdriver. Instead, Elias unrolled a set of pristine, custom-machined brass horology tools. Tiny drivers, microcalipers, tuning forks, the tools of a master watchmaker. Before the factory failed, before the corporate buyouts and the layoffs, Elias Thorne hadn't been a janitor. He had been the chief engineer. He was the last apprentice of Arthur Harrison himself. When the new management took over 10 years ago, they deemed his mechanical expertise obsolete in the digital age. They offered him an early retirement. Elias had refused. He took the only job they would give him, cleaning the floors. He did it because he couldn't bear to leave the machines he had spent his life maintaining. He stayed to watch over them in the dark. Julian watched in absolute awe as Elias reached into the complex, grease-covered machinery above the cab. The old man wasn't hacking at it. He was performing surgery. He felt the tension of the gears with his bare fingertips. He used a brass micro-driver to release a pin no larger than a grain of rice from the governor switch. He didn't need to see it perfectly. His hands had memorized the geography of this machine 50 years ago. Clack. A deep, metallic echo reverberated through the shaft. The emergency brake disengaged. Elias climbed down from the bucket. He wiped his hands on a rag, rolled his beautiful tools back into their leather pouch, and looked at Julian. He reached out his hand, palm up. Julian stared at it. Then, slowly, Julian realized what the old man wanted. Julian looked down at his own wrist. He unclasped the $85,000 Patek Philippe watch and placed it gently into the old man's calloused palm. Elias didn't look at the diamonds or the brand name. He held the watch by the casing. He closed his eyes and pressed his thumb against the crystal. He felt the micro vibrations of the escapement wheel. He felt the balance spring breathing. Elias opened his eyes, looked at Julian, and gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. It was the nod of a craftsman recognizing a good piece of machinery. Then, Elias reached over to the manual override lever, a brass wheel Julian hadn't even noticed beneath the dust. Elias gripped it with both hands, muscles cording in his forearms, and pulled. With a deafening groan, the elevator began to move. Not with electricity. Elias was manually bleeding the hydraulic pressure, lowering them inch by inch to the basement floor safely. When the doors finally opened into the dimly lit basement, Julian stumbled out, gasping the cool, stale air. He was covered in sweat, his expensive clothes ruined. He turned back to look at the elevator. Elias was calmly picking up his mop bucket. He stepped out of the cab, handed Julian his watch back, and turned to walk down the hall to finish his shift. "Wait!" Julian shouted, his voice cracked. Elias kept walking. He couldn't hear him. Julian ran after him, stepping in front of the old man to stop him. Julian stood there, chest heaving, looking into the deep, calm eyes of the janitor he had planned to throw out onto the street in less than an hour. Julian Vance, the man who calculated the price of everything, finally understood that he knew the true value of nothing. The next morning at 8 a.m., the demolition crew arrived at the Harrison Clockworks with their bulldozers. They found Julian Vance sitting on the front steps, wearing a ruined Italian suit, drinking coffee from a paper cup. He stood up, walked over to the foreman, and handed him a piece of paper. It was a cancellation order. Vanguard Acquisitions did not sell the building. Over the next 2 years, Julian Vance poured his own money into retrofitting the factory. He didn't turn it into luxury condos. He turned it into the premier mechanical restoration academy in the country, teaching a new generation how to build and fix the things the digital world had forgotten. And the dean of that academy? A 74-year-old deaf man in a slate blue jumpsuit who taught his students that before you can fix a machine, you first have to learn how to listen to it.